Good afternoon and welcome to Praxis Peace Institute's weekly program on Zoom. I'm Georgia Kelly, the director of Praxis. Today we are fortunate to host a legal scholar who's going to talk about autocrats, authoritarianism, science denial, and what to expect in the 2024 election cycle. Richard Abel is a professor of law, a specialist in African law studies, and a renowned socio-legal scholar. He received a BA from Harvard University, an LL.B. from Columbia, and a Ph.D. from the University of London, where he was a Marshall Scholar. He has been a member of the faculty of UCLA School of Law since 1974 and is a past president of the Law and Society Association and editor of the Law and Science Review. Today, we are featuring two of his books, How Autocrats Attack Expertise and How Autocrats Abuse Power. These are the books, so you can see them. I highly recommend them. So welcome, Richard. It's wonderful to have you with us today.
Thank you. I'm delighted to be here.
Great. Well, I have lots of ideas of things we can talk about. And I know many on this call and those who will hear this later are worried about the 2024 election and possible post-election fallout. Part of our anxiety deals with the topics in your book, authoritarian factions and the anti-science contingent, which is not only the right wing, it's also a lot of New Agers too. So I want to talk about that. In your book, How Autocrats Attack Expertise, you focused primarily on the disinformation perpetrated by the right that initially made light of COVID and then made fun of mask wearing and distancing, and finally even tried absurd remedies promoted by our then president. Can you say something about this disdain for science that the Trump camp champions, even in the face of clear evidence to the contrary, like when bleach sent people to the hospital instead of recovery? How do autocrats like Trump get by with this? And why do people keep believing this?
It's a very good question. I really don't have an answer. Maybe I should preface that by saying I think the effort to get inside Trump's head is a fool's errand. Not because, as people said of Reagan, as Doonesbury said of Reagan, there was nothing there, but because it's basically unknowable. There have been attempts by people who are trained in the subject, psychologists, psychiatrists, psychotherapists, to try to understand Trump's mentality, but without, an extensive interview or analysis of him in person. I think most people feel that that's unlikely to produce a great deal of insight. I think we do know this. Trump demands authority, absolute power, deference. He doesn't take advice from anybody, as far as I can tell, and he is used to that kind of obedience in his business dealings, where, of course, he could fire people. His favorite phrase on The Apprentice was "You're fired." That kind of power, and he did the same as president. The turnover in his cabinet was higher than I think in any presidency in recent history. That doesn't really explain why he did what he did, but he wanted to pick the people he would listen to, in part because they told him what he wanted to hear, and of course he could fire them if they didn't. He really resented the fact that Anthony Fauci was an expert, was the leading expert in epidemiology, especially viral epidemiology, and people had a great deal of respect for him. Trump didn't want that kind of challenge to his authority. For instance, he replaced he made Pence the head of his task force when Pence knew nothing at all about science, because he knew Pence would do whatever he asked him to do, as Pence did up until the last minute of January 6, 2021. So it is, I think, a desire to exert power without being questioned. But why he cottoned on to the particular remedies he did, I have no insight into.
Yeah, they were so bizarre. And the fact that people didn't challenge him after they were proven to be not only ineffective, but dangerous, which shows to me kind of a cultish behavior of total obedience. But you also mentioned something else I think that's really important to look at, and this is a politics of resentment, how he kind of weaponized people's maybe under the surface hatreds, targeting immigrants or other ethnicities, creating scapegoats, which seem to cement this cult and cultish behavior. Can you talk a little bit about that, about this politics of resentment that he's tapped into?
Okay, well, I can say one thing with complete confidence, which is this is the center of Trump's 2024 campaign, as it was of his 2020 campaign, as it was in his 2016 campaign. So it's a long-standing theme of his. Again, whether he believes it is unknowable, but he, I think, correctly intuited that there was a great deal of fear of immigrants and immigration, and he has made that the centerpiece of his campaign. Um, why? Well, I'll put it in these terms, and this is I'm gonna do it anecdotally rather than social theoretically, but I can do the latter in a minute if you like.
Okay.
I live in Los Angeles. I come from New York originally. A couple of weeks ago, I was back east in both New York and Boston. In those cities and other major American cities, you see the whole panorama of ethnicities, genders, social, sexual orientations, ages, religious orientations. We are an incredibly diverse society. You ride the New York subway, you ride the MTA in Boston. It is an extraordinarily diverse landscape. That's what I was brought up. That's what I'm comfortable with, and that's what I sort of take for granted. But many people in the United States have a different lived experience. It's an experience where they look around a relatively small community, typically a small town or a rural area, where everybody looks more or less like them, where they've known those people their entire lives. Their parents knew those people, their grandparents knew those people. They derive a great sense of comfort, a sense of belongingness, a sense of identity from that kind of taken for grantedness that everybody is like them and they are the right way of being.
Mhm.
That is changing rapidly. It's going to change even more rapidly. It is inevitable, and it's very frightening. So I think that is what Trump is tapping into. I went to the farmers market on Wednesday, and I heard a conversation between a Latino buyer and a grower who I don't think was Latino about immigrants. And the buyer said he had property in Texas and he hated the immigrants and they were just pouring across the border and they didn't want to work. They just wanted to live off of welfare. Well, that's an extraordinary statement to make. There is no welfare. We know that. And immigrants wouldn't be eligible for whatever there was. So the question is, where does this come from? Where does this set? It's like the resentment of African American women who lived off welfare in the 1970s, which Ronald Reagan, among other people, used again for political reasons. So there is this feeling among people who that they themselves work hard, other people are slothful and are living off of their hard work, and they're very resentful of that.
And it's all been created. It's a mythology that people choose to believe, I think partially targeting. I want to go to the 24, but first I should comment on, because you mentioned that about the immigrants taking all the welfare when they're not eligible for it anyway. And it is tapping into exactly what you mentioned, Ronald Reagan's welfare queen, which was really code for a Black woman. And I think, you know, a lot of us understood that, maybe everybody did, but it again was another type of target. But as we,
Can I just interrupt for a second because I want to just say use that. So
okay,
one of the things Trump has said recently about immigrants, he's actually said it repeatedly, is he wants immigrants from, I'll use my fake quotes, from nice countries, and he names them: Denmark, Norway, and Switzerland. It's very interesting that he doesn't name Germany, which is where his father's family comes from, for
right,
pretty obvious reasons. And he says, but instead they come from the Congo. Well, there isn't a Congo. There are actually two countries quite different that have Congo in their names. But the Congo is the same as the Black welfare mother. It is a stereotype, and it's a frightening one.
right.
The likelihood of encountering somebody from the Congo is infinitesimally small, but yes, I'm sure there are immigrants from each of the two Congos.
But it's a buzzword. Yeah. So as we near the in the 2024 election cycle, there are too many loose cannons to feel secure about the outcome. Biden's role in aiding Netanyahu's war on the Palestinians has alienated a lot of young people, as we see from the protests on campuses all across the country. New age anti-vaxxers are voting for RFK Jr., and swing states and the Electoral College could give a minority the White House again. What do you think needs to happen between now and then? And do you think what I just said is realistic? And if so, what needs to happen that we can guarantee there'll be a Democratic win instead of a split that will bring Trump back to the White House, which we can't afford?
Well, everything you say is true, and I'm inevitably when I try to summarize the findings of my book, it sounds like a very pessimistic scenario, and I don't want to leave people with pessimism because pessimism leads typically to paralysis, not to activism. So I do want to come in a minute to the sources of hope and the directions in which one could work. As you know, Hillary Clinton won the popular vote with by 3 million. And Joe Biden won the popular vote by 7 million. So in a sense, the electorate seems to be increasingly Democrat. But that, of course, isn't what counts. Roughly a switch of 40,000 votes in the 2020 election would have given the Electoral College to Trump, and he would have actually won and retained office. So that it is those swing states that are absolutely critical. And Democratic strategists know this, and that's where they're inevitably going to focus their effort. I would just say this about the possibility of third-party candidates and what they're likely to do. The polling is going on, and it's going to change over time, and RFK Jr. is going to take votes from both parties. It's hard to say now whether he's going to take more from one party rather than another. The one fear I have is that if neither party gets an absolute majority in the Electoral College, my understanding under the Electoral Count Act is that the outcome will be given to the states with each state having one vote, and that decision will be made by state legislatures. And at the moment, Republicans control 26 of the state legislatures. So if that is the outcome, Republicans may win, but neither by an electoral popular majority nor an electoral college majority, but by a process that has never happened before. So talk about lack of legitimacy and concern about popular unrest and the uncertainties that all of that will bring, and then the litigation that will result, and the fact that it will go ultimately to a Supreme Court with 6 Republican votes, 3 of them chosen by Trump, whose behavior has been reprehensible in recent years. So all of that is true, and so I think the answer has to be that the focus, as I'm sure the Democratic Party will make its focus, on the swing states and trying to turn out Democratic voters in those states.
Now, this process you just talked about that has never been done, how possible is that?
Well, I really don't know because it's never happened before. It was one of the scenarios that was being put forward by Trump's lawyers. They were lawyers, but several of them are now in the midst of disciplinary proceedings, so their legal expertise is somewhat in doubt. But the answer is, unlike when Trump said to Pence, just give me the election.
Right.
Pence clearly could not do that, and Pence was right, and he got good legal advice about that. But the other scenario was not inconceivable. It wouldn't have worked in the 2020 election because there was no state where the result was contested. That was Trump's argument, that the result was contested, and therefore he had to go back to the state legislatures. Well, that was simply not true. There were the Electoral College ballots had been certified in all the states that Trump was trying to turn to his advantage. So he didn't have an argument. But in this case of a lack of an absolute majority in the Electoral College, that's unknown territory. And election law is a very complicated subject. There are actually very few experts. I do have a colleague, Rick Hasen, who is an expert. You might want to try to get him on your as a speaker sometime in the next couple of months. He's very eloquent and very knowledgeable. Hasen. Um, I don't want to opine further about that because it goes beyond my expertise.
No, I understand. Well, and it's very disconcerting when we think of we might be going into uncharted terrain that could actually throw us in what a lot of people call a constitutional crisis. So that's a little scary. And yesterday, when you and I spoke, we talked about the insurrection that happened on January 6th in 2021. And you mentioned that 1,400 people have been sentenced for their role in this debacle. But the elephant in the room is why their leader, Trump, who instigated the whole thing, has never been charged with sedition, goes on and can even run for president instead of being in prison. So that's one part, which just completely shocks me almost every day. So if you have any thoughts about that, I would like to know. And then following on that, if Trump loses, which hopefully he will, are we looking at another repeat of this scenario on January 6th in 2021 in the coming January?
Okay, let me respond to the second because I actually find that an easier question.
Okay.
So obviously I was appalled, as was everybody else, by the events on January 6th. I think an insurrection is the only appropriate name for it. And of course, that name was invoked under the rubric of the 14th Amendment, Section 3, which says that people who participate in insurrection cannot run for office. And then, as you know, the Supreme Court decided that it did not feel that it was appropriate for each state to make that decision individually. I've got to say that although I was appalled and felt terrible about both the members of Congress and the police who were beleaguered, suffered hundreds of them suffered injuries and 5 of them died, I never doubted the outcome. There were 2,000 people who were prepared to do battle. 2,000 people is not enough to overthrow the government of the United States. We're not in Civil War territory. We're not in countries where, well, I've just been reading the history of Germany in 1932, 33. There's actually a superb book that just came out about that. Really to try to understand whether we can gain insights from that experience as to what might happen. Hitler's SA had hundreds of thousands of fully armed people carrying weapons up to machine guns, and they could be mobilized and were parading in the streets and were fighting pitched battles with the communists throughout 1932, 33. It's a very different scenario from where we are now. Yes, the Proud Boys, the Oath Keepers, the 3%ers, and other state militias, they're frightening and they're bad, and they deserve to be locked up when they commit crimes. They don't have the power to overthrow the government. So I'm not that concerned about that. Now, of course, I've forgotten the first part of your question, Georgia. So if you can remember it, I'll go back to it.
Well, so you don't expect that there would be another attempt, or do you?
I don't think there'll be an organized attempt. I don't remember what happened is that Trump and many of his supporters had been talking about a demonstration on the day that Congress was to certify the results of the Electoral College, i.e. January 6th. They've been talking about that for about 3 weeks in advance. And the Proud Boys had held their own demonstration in DC, and Trump had approved of them, had even done a flyby with his helicopter. But we were still talking about a very small number of people. This was not, they didn't bring 1 million people to Washington. It wasn't, for instance, like the Women's March in the immediate aftermath of Trump's inauguration, which was the largest demonstration in American history nationwide. It was so large that my efforts to get downtown to Los Angeles were frustrated because so many people wanted to get on the light rail that you actually couldn't force your way onto it. That's not what we're talking about. There isn't that kind of national mass movement, complete with people bearing arms, coordination, strategizing. Yes, they can cause a lot of damage, but most of that damage will be to themselves, or at least a great deal of it will be.
Well, that's reassuring. And I think the other thing that we may not look at is that when Trump was planning all that, he was still president. And he's
Yes.
not president now. So
Right.
he's in a different power struggle. You mentioned this book on Germany. What is the name of it?
Yeah. So let me get it. The name is Takeover. The subtitle is Hitler's Final Rise to Power. The author is Timothy Ryback, Ryback. I looked him up. He's clearly an eminent historian. He doesn't seem to have one position. He works in Amsterdam, he works at Harvard, and in various other places. So I haven't been able to find an email for him.
Hmm.
Um, but it's a very lively account, day by day, sometimes hour by hour, from local newspapers, diaries, messages, etc. And I really find it riveting. I'm halfway through it, and I had to put it down to participate in this conversation, which I'm happy to do, but I'm going to go right back to it
Well,
later.
that's
Um,
good
and
to hear.
and and as I said, it tells you something about the nature of the forces that were engaged at that moment in German history. Do you want me to say more about the parallels and lack thereof between
Yes,
Germany?
please do.
Oh, okay, let me say something about that. Germany, in the immediate aftermath of World War I, of course, suffered a crushing defeat, were required to pay huge reparations. By the way, did you know that the last dollar of those reparations wasn't paid off until 2010?
Oh,
That was a
goodness.
factoid I just encountered in my research. I thought it had been paid off before the end of before World War II.
Yeah,
So enormous reparations, a loss of territory, of course, and then massive
I think you just froze.
of a
Uh,
kind that we have never experienced. You who are participating in this were stamp collectors. I was in my youth, not a very serious one, but I have stamps from that period in Germany, 1930s, with the overmark. So stamps that were worth, 20 Deutschmarks were overmarked at 20 billion Deutschmarks. That's what it would cost to send a postcard across Berlin at that time. So those were the things that were going on. And there were these two large forces that were arrayed against each other. There were the Nazis growing in power very rapidly during that period, and initially a much larger communist and socialist and social democratic left. And those forces were at total loggerheads. They each had armed members, and they did engage in pitched battles in which people died. And this book and other books that I've read indicate that if you were to pick up a newspaper in Germany in 1930, 1932, 33, you were likely to encounter accounts of people being killed in the streets almost every day because these things were ongoing. So none of that was happening. But, and here's the big but. Georgia, stop me if I'm going on too
no, no,
long-winded.
this is interesting.
Okay. Okay, so I came at this from another direction, and this is partly autobiographical, so I'll put it in here because it will tell you why I was interested in this. Um, my grandparents were immigrants from Russia, Jewish immigrants from Russia, actually from Ukraine, from Odessa and from Dnipro. So I have a very strong feeling of connection with immigrants, as I think many people of my generation do. My father is the son of an immigrant, got a college education, and then became involved in the New School for Social Research in New York, starting in the mid 1930s. First as a graduate student, he got a master's and then a PhD, and then as a professor. And from the early 1950s until almost until his death in 1997, he taught and was eventually a member of the administration in philosophy. So I had a very strong sense of connection to the new school. For instance, I'm pretty sure of this. Hannah Arendt used to come to our house for dinner parties
Oh,
because
how lucky.
she was a member of the philosophy faculty. That doesn't mean I met her, but um,
Maybe you did.
okay. So my daughter Heather has a book simply called The New School, which is an intellectual history of the New School, which I read with fascination. And I learned the following, as some of you may know if you know anything about this. The New School had as a portion of it, a department, a division within it, the university in exile. It welcomed twice in the 1920s and the 1930s refugees from the rise of Nazism, especially from Germany, although to a lesser extent from Mussolini's Italy. And that they were a large part of the faculties, especially in philosophy and sociology and economics at the time. Many of those people, some of them were Jewish, all of them were on the left. So they either left because they were Jewish or because they were going to be persecuted politically and thrown out of their jobs. They wrote about how they understood the rise of Hitler. So I mean, here they were dealing with this conundrum, which is Germany at the end of the 19th century and the early 20th century was the intellectual focus of Western Europe. It was where Americans went to study if you wanted to do graduate studies. Talcott Parsons, the sociologist, went to study in Germany. That may be reason. I don't know if any of you ever read Parsons. People said Parsons wrote English as though it was German, and it was almost entirely incomprehensible. But here's an example. That's where you went. How could, and of course, they are the country of Bach and Brahms and Beethoven and Wagner and of Schiller and Goethe, et cetera, et cetera. How could they have turned in this direction? Okay, this is the explanation that was offered by these Germans refugees, which is that there was a class of people who felt they were losing their social status. It was more about status and less about income, although the two are closely related, because in Germany, which was still a status-based society, which had a clear aristocracy, people with fun in their name. It was a society in which people had a very clear sense of place. So these people who felt they were, hold on a second, let me just close the door so you don't hear my phone ringing in the other room.
Okay. And as soon as he finishes, we'll go to questions from the audience. So you may want to prepare if you'd like to ask something, and I will call on you as your hand comes up on the screen.
Okay, sorry about that. So these people were small business people, shopkeepers, farmers, and the professional classes. And what is happening to them was, first, a very high level of unemployment, again, far in excess of anything that happened in the United States. And secondly, a feeling that all employment was contingent. They were transformed from independent business people or professionals into salaried employees. Not only that, but they were paid by the hour, not by the month. They could be laid off at any time. They never knew from day to day how much work they would get. It was the contingent workforce, the gig economy, 100 years before we became familiar with it. So they were they were feeling enormous uncertainty. And what they looked for was somebody who said, I can solve this problem. Give me power. I know what to do. I can make things better. I can restore you to what you have lost. Does that sound familiar?
Yes, it does.
It's exactly what Trump has been saying. And he's been saying it to a different category of people. So he's been saying it to rural residents, to people who are probably mostly in the lower middle class, people who thought they had a clear path to success ahead of them and no longer see that. And I'll just add one more thing about this. The sense of uncertainty, which is clearly tied to the fear of immigrants and of a more heterogeneous population, is also tied to the rapidity of technological change, which we see all around us, to artificial intelligence, to our dependence on technologies that we don't understand, like what we're doing right now. Fortunately, Georgia was able to organize this, and I was simply asked to sign in, but I could not create this event by myself. And when my computer doesn't do what I expected to do. Have to throw myself on a fortunately very good IT department at UCLA. So it's that sense of insecurity, uncertainty, dependence, and that leads to one, I think, of two likely psychological responses. An inward turning response, a sense of despair, discouragement, just pulling the blanket over your head and hoping it will all go away, or an outward turning one in which you want somebody, A, to solve the problem for you, and you want somebody to blame. And Trump offers both of those.
It's kind of like taking a childlike position to a leader. Yeah,
Yes.
that's an immature quality, but it's prevalent. So thank you for this in-depth and detailed explanation. It's a place I didn't expect to go, but really appreciate the information because it relates directly to the Trump camp. So I'm going to ask anyone who wants to ask a question, this is the time to do it. If you're not in shock. Sometimes it takes, okay, we've got Robert. Bob, you want to ask a question?
Yeah, it's an interesting discussion about Germany, but I'd suggest maybe a better and more worrisome model was late 1930s Italy, because Italy had been an actual democracy, more or less. Germany never really had a democracy before post-World War II. I mean, it was a kingdom, it had Kaisers, it was pretty autocratic in different ways for most of its history. Italy, though, had been a fairly democratic country and started suffering many of the same woes that we're seeing in this country, economic, employment, and Benito Mussolini stepped in and said, I'll fix everything. Italy became ruled by a dictator. For a short time, it was shortened because of the war. He was defeated. You know, that's pretty dramatic end to something. But I would suggest that I've got a good friend in Italy who's 89 tomorrow, and he was 7 years old when in Rome when Benito Mussolini came into power. And I've talked to him extensively about this. I'm certainly not a scholar of that era by any means, but what he's related, it's a much more mirrored situation to what I'm really worried about this, because not because of Trump, but because of the number of people who are willing to listen to that argument. And it's a growing number of people. And you name some of the reasons at near the end there. But that audience is, and we're not doing much to make that audience change.
You have any comment on that, Richard?
Well, yes, so people have said Trump presents himself as powerful. He has the stature of someone. He talks in a very loud voice. He shouts people down. He uses incredibly vulgar and profane language, which actually no American successful political leader has used in the past. And he offers very simple solutions to very complicated problems. He says, for instance, on day one, I'm going to close the border. Well, he's not going to close the border on day one. He's not going to close the border at all because the border can't be closed. But that's what people want to hear. And that's, of course, Robert, I think you're absolutely right. I talk more about Germany than about Italy because the historical record of the emigre population reflecting on what was going on in their countries is much richer for Germany than for Italy, for reasons I don't really know. But of course, we see it happening throughout Europe. We see it in Hungary and in Poland and in Russia and in China.
Oops. Something happened.
He muted himself by accident.
You muted yourself, Richard.
Yeah, Richard. I don't,
Okay, I'm back.
okay, whatever you said, we didn't hear it.
Yeah, well, talk about being dependent on technology.
Right.
We see these we see this phenomenon in Poland, Hungary. We see it in the right in Italy now from the Meloni, the current prime minister. We see it in the rise of the AfD in Germany. We see it in Russia, in China, and in Israel. I mean, it's happening all over the world. And the fact that it's happening in so many places makes it multiply frightening, because obviously it's drawing on some of the same phenomena. And again, immigration and immigrants are part of the reason, although, again, it doesn't actually require that immigrants be present. Hungary is using the fear of immigration as a means for Orban to hold on to power, but there are no immigrants in Hungary because you have to learn Hungarian in order to survive, and it's a very difficult language to learn. So people actually don't want to immigrate to Hungary; they want to go someplace else. They may pass through. So yes, there is a real fear, and I think it's going to. Let's assume for the moment that Trump loses, which I think would be the most, obviously the optimum scenario. It's not going to go away. Other politicians are going to pick this up and run with it. People have mentioned to me that, of course, that Patrick Buchanan tried the same thing some years ago. And one of the interesting questions, to which I don't really have an answer, is why, when Buchanan, who is also arguing for building a wall along the border, why he was so unsuccessful at that moment, and Trump is so successful at this moment. As always, these things are overdetermined. There are multiple reasons for it.
Timing is everything, as they say. So, Ben, you have your hand up. Ben? You're mute, Ben. Well, if you don't unmute, we might go elsewhere.
There we go.
Okay.
Okay. Yeah, I was looking for the button. It was lost on my new phone. So you talked early on about the rejection of expertise, and how the people, that there's this trend on the right to deny science. And that was the first time I really started getting worried about the American society, was when I realized that we might not survive another major pandemic, because we've reached such a level of social and intellectual lack of communication that I don't think, just the fact that we were incapable, even though we had the resources, we had the vaccine. Concerns me very much. And it reminds me, the root of this, just to finish this up, there was a neoconservative philosopher, a woman named Gertrude Himmelfarb, who was married to Irving Kristol, father of Bill Kristol. So she's got a good pedigree. And she was one of the first people to really lead this attack on science, because she understood intuitively that having an expert class gives them power, and power should only be granted to those who should exercise it, are natural rulers. And that this denial of expertise is a way of people who lack that kind of capacity to say, no, we don't have to listen to these people. We can ignore them. They're irrelevant. They're just egghead, university professors. So I'd like to hear what you had to say about that.
Well, you certainly have hit the button, because it is a totally contradictory position. I do understand why people are resentful of their dependence on experts. It's a frightening. Well, here's an example that we can all relate to. I think probably, maybe not all, but many of us. Your car isn't behaving properly. You take it into the shop, and the mechanic says, well, not only do you have this problem, but you've got that problem and that problem and that problem, and it's going to cost $3,000. It's terrifying. And you don't know whether each of those problems are there or whether the mechanic is making it up. Obviously, the mechanic has a reason, an incentive to find all these things wrong with you. The same thing happens. You take your body into the doctor's office and they run all these tests and they find all these things wrong with you. So you're terrified of that kind of dependence. And yet there is no alternative. After all, we've known since Adam Smith, we've known since Durkheim that the division of labor and specialization is the only way to enjoy all the comforts and advantages that we do enjoy in 21st century society. So I'll put this question back to all of you as for me, a paradox that I really don't understand. Why is it that the people who are so suspicious of vaccines blithely drive cars, operate computers, or consign themselves to airplanes when they don't know anything about how they're built or how they're operated or how safe they are? What is there about the vaccine and the dependence on it that is so much more frightening than our throwing ourselves on the expertise of people all the time, every minute of our lives?
Well, then we're going back to conspiracy theories, I think. And we're living in a time where these have they greatly appeal to a lot of people, especially people looking for simple answers to complicated problems. And conspiracies give you answers for everything. And it takes the place of an expert. It's a belief system. It's almost like a religion, I think. And apparently that was true in Nazi Germany during and before the Hitler era, where there was kind of a new age movement where people believed in conspiracies, and they're easier to convince of things that are faith-based because they can't be proven. I think that's an interesting thing to take up. Elitism is part of this expertise, and elitism is definitely questioned by the Trump camp. And often they're equating, and I didn't realize this until maybe 8 years ago. I really didn't get that what they call elitism are educated people. People like you. You're an elite because you have a Ph.D. Or someone else is elite because they went to college. Or you become an expert at something, so you're an elite. And I didn't realize that was what they were thinking of as elite, not wealthy people, but experts. So we're up against that.
Again, there's a huge amount of polling data on the demographics of Trump supporters. And the one variable that is consistently the most significant is whether or not people have a post-secondary education. So the division between those who have at least some college or a college degree and those who do not is, there are many other variables, but that's the single most significant variable explaining Trump supporters. And I would tie that, but again, this is complicated and I don't pretend to understand it, to the fact that Trump and Trumpists, as I'll call them, have decided to make universities in general a target. So that began long before the current Gaza and Hamas. It began with the attack on critical race theory and also on LGBTQ programs in universities. And then the extraordinary, I mean, the McCarthyite parade of university presidents down to Washington who are taken on the carpet and dressed down by people who went to the same universities but decide to make those universities the targets, right? With the result that a number of them have been presidents have been forced out. And you know, it is a very convenient target. I'll just give you two examples and I'll stop because I want to hear what other people have to say. Harvard is the sort of quintessential target.
Right.
Harvard's endowment is larger than the total wealth, the net worth of all but 8 countries in the world. So there are reasons to dislike Harvard. And of course, it's also almost impossible to get into elite universities these days because, again, just to put it back into context, I went to Harvard. I'm not saying that by way of boasting, but when I went to Harvard, it was all white men. So it was a lot easier to get into then than now. Now it is half women and probably a very significant proportion from overseas. So the competition is fierce, which makes it inaccessible, which makes people angry.
And there's the legacy students. fathers went there. Well, like George W. Bush, who would never have gotten into Yale if it hadn't been for daddy and granddaddy. So there are those legacy entrants. So Mike has his hand up. So Mike, do you want to ask your question?
Thanks. Yeah, first I just want to say, Richard, this is great, really great. But the thing I'm really going to take the most positive thing, which is so hard to find with what's happening over these last, I'd like to say 10 years since Trump stepped down the stupid escalator, is that what you said about the numbers in Germany. I never really thought of it quite like that. So the hundreds of thousands were very well armed. And here in America, we got, some very Proud Boys and all these other ridiculous groups, which don't really have too many people. But the thing is, as everybody noticed, the election itself, January 20, went really well, really smooth. Why? 20,000 troops there or something like that, 25,000 troops. So if that had been, I think, on January 6th, I don't think that ever would have happened. But also just this whole thing with the Electoral College completely makes me insane because I'm just looking at some stats from California. There's about 10 or 11 million Democrats who vote, Democratic eligible voters, about 5 million Republicans, and about 5 million no party affiliation. Democrats alone, which they did, well, won by 3 million with Hillary. In California, by 4 million, I think Hillary won, would put the president in. But it doesn't matter if it's 22 million to 0, okay? It's 58 votes, right? So that to me is completely insane. You take all these little dinky little states that get 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, it all adds up. And California, it doesn't matter. Not to mention it's 3 hours later and the day's already over. So something has to change here. It's complete insanity. California alone, Trump would never win. I mean, I'm just saying. So I just don't know what, if anything, what can people do about this insane thing? And then the thing you said today, I never heard in my life about the legislation thing. If the Electoral College doesn't work, that's scary. But I'm glad what you said about the couple of thousand people that probably will not take over the government. I'm going to take that with me right for a long time up to the election day. Thank you.
Okay, I want to say, I'm going to respond specifically to the question and then say something hopeful as well. Again, I mentioned my colleague Rick Hasen, Hasen. He has actually several books on voting issues, but he has a book that just came out about what he thinks has to be done to transform the nature of our electoral process. And I went to a Q&A in which he spoke, and people said to him, Rick, that's not going to happen tomorrow. It's not going to happen in time for 24 or 28 or 32. And he said, yes, this is a program for my children and my grandchildren. We are stuck with a system that we inherited, which is 225 years old. It's a lousy system, and to change it is going to take a major effort. It's going to be a campaign. It's going to take a long time. But let me offer a slightly different kind of hopeful note, which is the 2020 election did in fact go quite smoothly, and the reason it did is that election workers who are proud of the work that they do did their jobs. And that was true in red states like Arizona, and it was true for election workers who themselves were lifelong Republicans who resented being told by Trump and Trump hirelings, this is what they should do. Look at Raffensperger, the Secretary of State in Georgia, who has been a Republican all his life, and who in fact most recently endorsed Trump in 24. But who said absolutely firmly, I have a job to do, and I'm going to do that job, and because I'm proud of it. There was a book written by Studs Terkel, the journalist, some 20 or 30 years ago. I think it was simply called Work, and it was a series of interviews with working people in a wide variety of jobs in the Chicago area. It's a superb book, and what it said is people are proud of what they do. After all, if you do something for a lifetime, you develop skills, you develop ways of doing it, you know how to do it better than anybody else, and you're proud of it. And you don't want somebody out there telling you what to do. So if there is a hopeful sign, it is that people like the 2 Black election workers in Atlanta, Georgia, in Fulton County, are going to do their jobs because they're proud of it.
Yeah, it's a good point. I have one more possible question. Do you want to take it or should we? It's up to you now. We don't
Happy
have.
to, yeah, go ahead.
Okay, Ben, I'm going to ask you to make it short because we're reaching the end of the hour. Go ahead. You have to unmute Ben. Guess his new phone. Ben, we don't hear you. I think his new phone is giving him trouble.
Unmute, Ben. Unmute.
Yeah, he seems to not be able to do it. In which case,
Call the
it-
UCLA Internet Department.
It proves my point about our dependence on technology, that we don't, what we need, of course, is a grandchild in the room at all times, but we're not all blessed with that.
well, often we have a techie who's not quite, well, maybe that young, but we have a techie on the calls, but he's not available right now, so he's not here today. But he can't deal with your problems often, so.
Oh, there he is. Ben fixed it. Go ahead.
Yeah, I finally found it. I'm scrolling around here trying to find all these hidden menus. Just to quickly here, I would probably not agree with your assertion that the right is not going to be better organized this time around, because I've been reading that they're working on two tracks. One, Agenda 2025, which is basically a way to have a illiberal democracy in the U.S. And then the Proud Boys and those affiliated groups have dug in, and the conjecture among them is, we look bad. We were not organized. We should put this together like an actual military campaign instead of a ragtag riot. So I think it could get pretty scary, particularly if it's close. And finally, I just want to ask you: you're at UCLA. Why did the campus go down so hard on that protest? We have one here at Sonoma State. The president there, Mike Lee, is just like, basically they're going to be graduating in 2 weeks. Sure, you can have a piece of the quad, knock yourself out. So I don't understand what the reasoning was down at UCLA.
Oh, I've been retired for 14 years, so I'm not part of the.
Oh,
of the
you're not
scene.
responsible for that.
I did sign a letter condemning our chancellor for his actions. So I'm entirely with you about that. On your other 2 points, yes, the agenda from the Heritage Foundation is a scary one. And one of the things that they are proposing to do is what Trump did at the very last couple of weeks of his presidency, which is this Schedule F, which would render 50,000 civil service jobs political appointees. And it would eliminate expertise because political hacks would be put in positions of power. That is very frightening. Obviously, I don't know what's happening in terms of military, paramilitary organizing on the far right. I don't have any particular insights into that. I am pleased by the fact that the leaders of the Oath Keepers and of the Proud Boys are in jail now for long terms, and I'm sure there are other people stepping into their shoes, but that undoubtedly has hurt those people. It's also true. I didn't think I'd ever be in a position of saying this, that I have a fair amount of trust in the FBI, who I think actually know what's going on. We know that, and because the Republicans kept on saying the FBI was in the Capitol on January 6th, and the answer is yes, there were some informants, not FBI agents. There were some FBI informants in the Capitol on January 6th. So I assume that the FBI has informants still in various right-wing groups, and I sure hope that they're keeping track of what's going on, but I can't say more than that.
Now, I always worry that our military is more in Trump's camp than the Democrats' camp. That's my final worry. But I hope I'm wrong.
Well, I would just say this about the military. Once again, I did not have to serve in Vietnam, and I'm not sure what I would have done had I been required to do so. I was of the right age at the time. But our military was very clear that they would not take a political role. And they talked to Nancy Pelosi and said, look, we are not going to intervene because we are scrupulously apolitical. Again, that's something that Trump wants to change in his second term. He wants to appoint the top brass, people who will do what he says. And that's very frightening. Yeah.
Well, we don't want him back in. So thank you. This has been really interesting. I learned a lot today and the 2 books that I mentioned, and I know you've got more coming down the pike. One is How Autocrats Abuse Power. The other is How Autocrats Attack Expertise. And just mention the ones you're working on now or that are.
Yes, well, there was a third book, How Autocrats Seek Power, which is actually more of what I was talking about today. So it was
Right.
about the 2016 and 2020 elections. And the one I'm working on now is called How Autocrats Are Held Accountable. And it's about everything that's happened since January 6, 2021. And I'll just conclude with what I hope is you'll find amusing, at least anyhow, it's my final anecdote. So in order to keep track of these books as I was working on them, I created acronyms for each of them. So How Autocrats Seek Power was HASP. How Autocrats Abuse Power was HAAP. How Autocrats Attack Expertise was HAAE. And the last book, which I'm working on now, How Autocrats Are Held Accountable, is HAHA, and that is AHA. So I'm hoping the joke is on them and not on us.
Right. Well, I will definitely be interested in that, both of the upcoming books. So thank you so much, Richard. You'll get a video of this link to our YouTube channel tonight. And I just want to thank you for being part of this. It's been a very interesting hour and discussion. Thank you.
Well, a pleasure to talk to you. And I know you'll all keep up the important work that you're doing. So
And
thanks
I'm going to
again.
send you some information, Richard, for your granddaughter who's studying harp.
Yes, please do. Yes.
All right.
Thank you, Richard.
Bye.
Bye.
Stay on for a few minutes.
Yeah, I'm just waiting. So those who have stayed on, if you want to talk a little bit, this is our water cooler time. Otherwise, we can finish.
That was great, Georgia. Thanks for getting him.
Yeah, I mean, it was really interesting when I got notice of it. I thought, and then being at UCLA, by the way, I was just at this reunion of activists at Stanford last weekend, which is why I've got COVID. But we spent time at a camp, the tent there, and talked to them. Had some of the young people were on the panels for the weekend, and their concern about what's going on was so impressive. And of course, everything's peaceful. And we all commented how we thought Stanford had learned that you don't bring in the cops. You do what Sonoma State's doing. You let them have their space, let them have their say. And it's been peaceful. There's been no problems there because of it. And I think that's what universities should be learning. Columbia and UCLA blew it.
Georgia, to make sure, did you say you got COVID there?
Yeah.
That's what you were talking about? Just this recent
Yeah,
thing
I
that you
got it last weekend. I have it now.
Whoa. Wow. How bad?
Well, obviously it's not too bad because I'm on this call.
Yeah, you sound great. Yeah.
Yeah, I had a fever for a couple of days. I don't
Wow.
know. I think
Wow.
it's on its last legs, hopefully.
Mm.
So, but it was a
Jeez.
super spreader. Almost,
Yeah.
I would say 2/3 of the people there got it.
Wow.
Yeah, not fun. But we've all been vaccinated, so it's not as bad as it could be otherwise. And I know Ben looks like he wants to say something.
Oh, yeah, I just, I've been talking a lot about the reaction to the student protest. And to me, this has been a laboratory for watching consent being manufactured wholesale. Because for the hours and hours of mainstream media footage, it's almost impossible to get any idea why are these kids out there. It's treated as like this is like a sorority prank or a fraternity stunt. And the kids themselves have been remarkably disciplined. I love the fact that one of the mainstream reporters came to one of these camps. Nobody would talk to him because they said, no, you need to talk to our media liaison, because the usual technique is to go find the craziest, most disheveled looking person to say, what do you think about this? And kill all Jews, And so that, they go, well, there you go. That's your protest for you. And they refuse to play that game. So then the mainstream media reporters are like, this is obviously evidence of foreign intervention, this level of discipline. There's a learning curve. They're smarter than you. That's why. And But it is depressing to see how many places just went right for this is what this kind of McCarthyite attack that Elise Stefanik and her ilk are doing is university presidents who are not generally very courageous kinds of, these are super bureaucrats. They're not the type of people they're going to do what they think is the right thing to do, which is apparently Columbia set the example by just call in the most brutal set of cops in riot gear, take out a bunch of skinny undergrads, you know.
Okay.
So I worry about the fact that the idea of the university is under attack because the real root of the problem beyond this particular issue, this has been going on for decades. This is what Gertrude Himmelfarb was all about. Is they don't like the idea of having independent centers of intellectual activity. It has to either be under their corporate aegis or under a state aegis. It should not be. They have never been sold on the Enlightenment idea of free discourse.
I'm going to interrupt you there, Ben.
I'm done. I'm finished.
Okay. I wanted to just mention to you before I forget, there was I don't know if you get the Index Tribune. This is our local paper in Sonoma. Did you see that article by Tom Elias? He is a syndicated columnist who writes for small papers all over the country. And it is horrible about the demonstrations. And I wrote an op-ed, which I sent to the Index. I think they're going to print it Wednesday. But I'll send you both copies because I was horrified. And if you can go back and look at it, it wasn't the one, most recent one. It was the one before. Like it was.
Elias is a hack. I don't know why. I never read it.
Well, you should sometimes. Sometimes he's good, but this time it was horrifying. So take a look at it. And does anyone else want to say anything before we finish? I think that's why I think our discussion topic should be the corporate media and where we need to get our news. If that's the only place we're getting it is the corporate media, we're not getting news. We're getting a total biased point of view. And Marjorie Cohn, who's going to be our speaker on June 7th, she spoke to the Stanford group last weekend, and she used that phrase. She said, I no longer call it the mainstream media. I call it the corporate media, because that really says what it is. It's not mainstream, middle of the road. It's a point of view. And that stuck in my mind. I will use it from now on.
Corporate media.
Yeah,
corporate media.
got it. Check.
Yes. I will tell Marjorie that. And I really recommend that everyone who's still left on this call hear Marjorie on June 7th. She is brilliant. And the essays that she was part of, the book, Differentiating Judaism from Zionism.
Can you ask her if she's gonna get that election law specialist?
That election law specialist, are you gonna get that? He was talking.
Oh yes, I will try to get him. Hassan, absolutely, I will. Yeah.
I never heard that before. Did you? Any of you ever
never
hear that before?
That's why
I
we
never
have
heard
these
anything
guys.
like that before.
They connect us to other people.
And now, you know, Barrett, he said what do you call him?
Legislator.
The legislator. Did you hear Barron, the big 6'8", 17-year-old kid? He's now a legislator in Florida.
You can believe that?
Another delegate, yeah, in Florida.
How come that little thumb?
Poor kid. I feel so bad for that kid.
Yeah, he got brainwashed.
Oh, God.
Badly.
It's in the Constitution as to what would happen if there was a tie in the Electoral College. And it does go to the House, but it goes by state, each state having one vote.
Wow.
So, yeah.
Wow.
You can get out your handy copy of the Constitution.
Yeah.
I knew that, but I didn't realize that it was I thought it would be like the House of Representatives would vote. I didn't realize it's a state by state. That's never been done.
Each state having one vote.
Wow.
That's unbelievable. And it doesn't depend on the Electoral College winning a particular state. It could be voting either way.
That I don't know. I'd have to look at that.
Wow.
I guess the real question is, how did we get to the point where we're having to entertain these edge cases? Why is this close? I do not get it. I don't understand.
Educating what?
Why are we discussing these edge cases? Why is it so damn close? It should not be this close.
Right, I agree.
That's
People-
that's the question of the century. They
Yeah.
stole it in 2000. They stole it in 2016. I mean, in a sense. So,
Mhm.
you know, that thing in Florida with the Chads and all that stuff. Remember that?
Oh, they've stolen so many elections. I mean, I really don't, I think Kerry won and I think Gore won.
Yeah.
Kerry,
yeah.
Gore
I
was,
think they're done with the elections business. That's what I'm finally getting. They're done with that. Trump is going to win no matter what. So
Oh.
just bank on that.
well,
think
I'm
so?
not gonna bank
You
on
think so, really?
Yep. Yeah, no, it doesn't matter. You have to understand it's postmodern. It doesn't matter what the totals are. He's going to win. And if he doesn't, it's a fraud. Guaranteed.
Oh, I see what you mean. Yeah.
Bank on it immediately. They've already predetermined that. That's already a fact on the ground. So
Well,
just be ready for that.
Yeah, but my old joke about that is you can't. He won in 2016. He lost in 2020, but he said he won. So now if he wins again, you can't win 3 times. That's illegal.
That's-
Yeah, good try. Yeah, send that.
point.
And nobody's listening. Yeah, but he
Send that
didn't
to
win.
the
Yeah,
court.
anyway, silly. Yeah.
Well, this is good. I'm so glad
right,
that you
thanks,
guys were
Georgia.
on today. And I will try to get Rick Hassan because he sounds like a really interesting person.
Thanks, Georgia.
Yeah, and definitely don't miss the talk on corporate media. And in the, I guess all of you know about Common Dreams, right?
Mhm.
commondreams.org. That's really non-corporate media, really, really good.
But
So
one thing I think it's important to watch corporate media at least sometimes to know what most people are seeing.
right.
Mhm.
Because if you don't understand why they're reacting the way they are, it's because, you know, we're getting different information.
My
Yeah.
solution to that is to use YouTube clip aggregators who then I get a complete
Yeah.
spectrum of all the important clips without having to slog through that track and then discussion around it. So I would recommend my favorite aggregator is the Majority Report. You can get most of the major clips of the day off that with some, guest commentary and expert analysis. So I would recommend that.
What did you call it? The report? What'd you call it?
The Majority Report. It's like the CNN of left YouTube. Everybody refers to it as a source. Everybody draws clips off of the Majority Report with Sam Peter.
Okay.
Just because he's been doing it for 20 years and it's on 3 hours a day. So it's, that to me is how I get my news. And then I have a few other subscriptions. Democracy Now! Has a great little 10-minute, I download this every day in my phone and listen to it. It's a little 10-minute news cap that gives you the international news. And you can get all of the relevant national political news out of the Majority Report. Who knows 2 sources? I get 80% of my mainstream information.
You're a pretty well-informed person, Ben. So I'm going to go.
Thanks, Ben.
because,
All right.
I'm not really operating on all cylinders at the moment, but
Well, get well soon.
thank you. I'm working on it, and I'll see you guys next week, I hope.
All right.
Okay.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.